Here I am, dear. It's Bee. I've come to give you a hand.
Oh, please don't come in, Beatrice. I don't want anyone to see my costume.
Oh. Oh, well, you won't be long, will you? Because the first people will be arriving any moment.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. So today I'm joined by Quin Garcia, who is Managing Director at Autotech Ventures. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
So Quin, when most of us say that they love cars, it just usually means that it's purely from consumerism, from perspective. Now, in your case, you love cars, and you've loved cars for apparently a long time because you also got your hands dirty as an auto mechanic and even a body shop repair technician. Can you tell us about that experience?
Sure. So as my interest in cars started with consumerism, I was a teenager who just loved fast cars and muscle cars and showing off with my friends and the like. I love the complexity of the machines. I love their utility, the leisure associated with it, going out and driving fast and racing and the like. And then I went off to Cornell and there I studied business and wanted to kind of feed my addiction to build more cars. And I found the Cornell hybrid electric vehicle team, which was developing hybrid SUVs, hybrid trucks. And that was my first taste of future transportation tech. And I had a little bit of a light bulb moment with that experience, and kind of realized that kind of the greater socioeconomic and environmental implications of transportation, and also had some friends die in car crashes. Started to think a little bit more about the safety implications. And so it became a little bit more than just say boy racer. And it started to become something more for me. And I decided that I was going to devote my career to solving transportation problems with technology. So this is my hobby and my passion. I love this stuff. I love startups, love transport and mobility.
Well, that's really profound, because you're able to tie it back to personal experiences, and in a very, very, very personal way, like you shared. Going back to when you were a mechanic, most car mechanics, at least the ones I've come across, really prefer kind of working on the older model versus the newer models that have, I don't know how many chips and microprocessors and controllers and all the complexities in the software. So from a practical, working on the car versus the advance and the future of automotive and everything ground transportation, what's your thought around, from the evolution of cars, but also the support model?
Right. So there's the evolution of cars and the tech that goes into them, but there's also the evolution of how we use them. How we move ourselves and how we move goods. I was kind of living in the past as a teenager on old muscle cars and classic cars and drag racing and the like, and eventually started to learn about advanced tech like hybrids and electric vehicles and advanced driver assistance systems. And I did a lot of work there in graduate school, and also as part of a startup called Better Place. And doing electric car recharging infrastructure. But I've also learned a bit about how we use cars, and I've changed my views around how I personally use them. As a challenge in 2016, I decided to sell all of my cars and experience new mobility services, kind of multimodal transit, if you will. So I started riding my bike. I started riding Lyft more and renting Turos and getarounds and the like. And I told myself I would do it for a year. And I realized during that year, my life was better. And so I'm actually now a carless car guy for the last 5 years, and I've never looked back. There's a lot of hidden costs. There's joys in vehicle ownership and operation, but there's also a lot of hidden costs as well.
Yeah, well, that's such a fascinating story, and certainly it makes a lot of sense for those that are working and living in city centers. But I believe you're in the Bay Area and the Greater Bay Area. It's one of those things where it's not like Paris or London or New York. You kind of do need a car. So for you to transition to multimodal, that's very interesting, and certainly you've living through the COVID times. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting stories to be shared as well.
Yeah, I live in the burbs here in Silicon Valley, so I'm not in downtown San Francisco or San Jose or Oakland. I'm in Portola Valley, and our office is in Menlo Park. So I'm not quite in the urban core, but there's still plenty of Lyft around here, and there's bicycles and there's other kind of options around. I will say that when I first undertook this adventure, I didn't have a kid. And we just had a daughter 6 months ago, and
congratulations.
And it certainly changes your needs related to a car. So I still don't have a car, but my partner Teresa does.
Amazing. That's amazing. Well, Amsterdam has adapted, right? So aside from just sheer amount of bicycles that are in Amsterdam, you actually see the adaptation of the bikes for families and specifically toddlers and young kids. Well, let's talk about Better Place, because you mentioned that. And I think you were doing automotive alliances at that company. And I wonder how that experience there, with some of those connections across automakers, tier one suppliers, battery manufacturers, and many others, how that really helped kind of build some of the foundational aspects of what would eventually become Autotech Ventures. Yeah.
So Better Place was a wild ride, a wonderful experience for me, ups and downs. And I was fresh out of grad school and joined Better Place as part of the founding team in 2007. There was the CEO and main founder, Quin Garcia, brilliant person, great visionary. And I jumped on board, and it took me around the world to Israel and Japan and China, living in those places, but then also traveled quite a bit to other parts of the world and learned about the transport sector and auto sector out there. And Better Place raised $1 billion. So we and Tesla were probably the most widely hyped transportation startups at that point in time, in 2007 to 2009. And Better Place also made some serious mistakes along the way, and I've taken those learnings forward with me now as a venture capitalist when I'm considering investment decisions and trying to help the entrepreneurs that we work with. And there's been a book written on Better Place called Totaled. If you ever want to read it, there's a chapter on me in the book. It's kind of funny. And that company, when I look back at the mistakes that we made as a firm, I think one of them was we raised too much money too soon. We just had this, Shai, just such a brilliant entrepreneur. We just had kind of infinite access to capital, raised too much money too soon, but that can cause you to do some undisciplined things, and that resulted in us expanding to too many geographies too soon, rather than just sticking with Israel and Denmark, which, in my opinion, had the best unit economics. It would also caused us to expand in terms of product line. So geographic expansion, product line extension, before we had actually proven the initial kind of product scope and the initial geographic scope. So I take those are kind of two important lessons that I've taken forward. Also, there were some governance lessons there as well. If you raise too much money too soon, your board can evolve pretty rapidly, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse in terms of governance.
Well, you've already covered the lessons learned portion, so thank you for that. And it's interesting because you've been in the automotive industry for a while, so you've seen all the ups and downs and really the exuberance. And with that comes these overcapitalization, overvaluation, and frankly, too much enthusiasm. Where perhaps maybe some of the founders, that like we've seen with the original Uber and many others, it can go to their head and ultimately start to really kind of erode into the core culture and DNA of that organization. But let's talk about your VC. Tell us a little bit more about your venture capital firm and how you guys are investing into startups that are solving the world's ground transport challenges.
You may also like our quarterly Ask Your Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit astroperkins.com/events.
Sure. So we are a venture capital firm that serves as a bridge between ground transport entrepreneurs who have a vision to solve some transportation challenge on one hand, and then on the other hand, corporations who know how to scale and may want to kind of tap the innovative spirit of one of these startups and other investors as well, other venture capital firms and the like. So we kind of play between those parties and invest into companies. And then after we invest into companies, we try to help them to scale. We try to help them raise capital from other investors, try to help them secure customers in the form of large corporations. No startup was ever successful without partnering with large corporations. So we try to help them with business development, transport specific recruiting, transport specific corporate development, and transport specific strategy.
Well, that is actually very refreshing to hear, because I think many VCs very much will participate in the cap table, but play a very passive role. So it's nice to hear that you guys are playing a very dynamic role, especially again in this sector where things are moving very, very quickly. Now, you've had a string of exits. Your team have, Lyft's IPO, Zonor AI acquired by Apple, DeepScale by Tesla, Frontier Car Group as an example, and many others. How has that experience, as well as the current portfolio that you're managing, how has that helped to kind of sharpen and look for the right type of startups? Can you talk about kind of a little bit of insight into how you evaluate companies?
Sure. So yeah, in addition to those exits that you just mentioned, we're also investors in Outdoorsy, which has grown to, it's Airbnb for motorhomes. It's grown to $1 billion plus. Recently, our company Volta Charging, which is ad-funded EV charging, just went public a little bit ago. And Indie Semiconductor, which is a fabless automotive chip design company in our portfolio, they also just went public. Kazoo, which is kind of like the Carvana of Europe, just went public a bit ago. And then recently Swivel in our portfolio, which is an on-demand transit van service in the Middle East and North Africa, just announced a SPAC merger with 100% women-led SPAC called the Queen's Gambit, given Swivel is helping women in those markets to get to work in kind of a safe environment. So SPAC mania has been very interesting and kind to us and to our portfolio and to a lot of VCs, frankly. In terms of how we think about companies and how the exits that we've had so far, we're still a pretty young firm. Has shaped our thinking. One way to think about it is fundamentals versus momentum. In an up market, momentum is very important, and I would argue we've been in an up market for a number of years now, and so there's been a lot of companies that may not have very strong fundamentals in terms of revenue and customer traction and the like, but who have had access to capital. They've been very strong in capital formation and been able to generate a lot of momentum from the investor community now, including the retail investor community. With SPAC mania happening, the way I think of it is SPAC mania has essentially just allowed retail investors who previously were boxed out of gaining exposure to startups. You had to be an accredited investor, an angel or a VC or a family office or what have you. Now, a lot of those investors who were previously boxed out can suddenly access startups with a startup-like risk-return profile, meaning pretty high risk and pretty high potential return. So momentum, pretty important in an up market. Fundamentals also important, although I would argue even more important in a softer market, in a down market. So we have companies in our portfolio that I could characterize as more momentum oriented, and then we have some companies that are a bit more fundamentals oriented.
So now let's get into some of the areas that you guys are looking at across everything from connectivity, autonomy, share use to electrification and digitization. What are some major themes that you could talk about that is unique to what's happening both in the last, let's say, 10 years, but also current as well as the next 10 years forward?
Yeah. So we, as you mentioned, so we call it CASED, CASED, connectivity, autonomy, shared use of assets, shared mobility, electrification, and then digitization, which is essentially e-commerce and industry 4.0. Those are the five main megatrends that we think have been important for years and will continue to be important for many years to come. We are really excited about the early stage. So we primarily invest at seed and Series A. We can opportunistically do, say, a B or a C, but we're mainly early stage. And we're also really interested in software and services, especially. So we do digital marketplaces, we do SaaS, embedded software. We can do some hardware as well, and we've co-invested in some hardware companies before. But we're looking more for capital light hardware companies. So you're not going to see us investing into the next Better Place or the next Tesla or Rivian. Great companies, but just not a fit for our model as kind of a smaller specialist fund. And within ground transport, which is basically movement of people and goods along the ground, we're interested in all the biggest pain points. So if there's some painful experience that a consumer is having or a business is having in context of movement and of people and goods, we're excited to find startup companies that are looking to solve that. And we are agnostic to the type of let's say, vehicle or transport service. So it could be, scooters. We've invested into some scooter companies. Could be passenger cars. Could be motorhomes, like we've invested into Outdoorsy. Delivery vans, we've invested into Pickup, which is last mile delivery of big and bulky items. Could be long haul trucks. We've invested into Truck Labs, which does energy efficiency for long haul trucks. Could be farm vehicles, like Verdant Robotics, which is automating spraying of crops. Could be mining or construction vehicles. We invested in Safe AI, which is automating fleets of mining and construction vehicles. So we're vehicle agnostic, and then we're really interested in all the different services related to those vehicles. How do you buy them? How do you sell them? How do you auction them, insure them, repair them, share them, refuel them, park them, right? All those verbs.
Now, as we're talking about some of these ground transportation, again, regardless of the types of vehicles, and again, I think there's a lot of different content that's out there in media, but can you talk about some things that is uniquely maybe more within those that are closer to the inside of the domain? Or perhaps maybe if you can elaborate on concepts or topics that have layers of complexities or challenges that, let's say, the most of our listeners or the mainstream would not understand or appreciate.
So the question is, what's being discussed in the media? What kind of nuanced view would I and our firm have around kind of a hot topic that's covered in the media?
I think I'm less interested in what the media has to say. I'm more interested in what the insiders have to say. Gotcha.
So one area that's been of interest to us is off-highway autonomy. We believe that autonomy is going to have the greatest impact on our society and our economy since the internet. We think that you have on-road autonomy, so last mile delivery bots like Nuro. You have long haul trucking like, say, Aurora. You have robo taxis like, say, a Waymo or what Zoox was intending to do, right? And then in the off-highway autonomy world, you have autonomous mining vehicles and construction vehicles, farm vehicles, warehouse vehicles, for example. In the off-highway world, a key difference is those vehicles tend to operate on private property. They tend not to operate on public roads that are controlled by the government. And when you operate on public roads, you're subject to greater regulation, and the safety implications are a bit more dire, right? And also the market opportunity is larger, right? So there's a larger market for on-road movement of people and goods than, say, off-highway, if you look at a ground transport context. So we've actually become pretty excited about off-highway autonomy because the time to market can be a bit shorter because the engineering implications it's not quite as challenging to engineer those vehicles to operate in private environments, and you don't have as much regulation that you need to navigate. So that would be an area that we feel maybe isn't discussed as much as it could be.
Actually, I'm really glad that you brought that up because it isn't discussed very readily in mainstream. And I like the fact that you guys are looking at it from early to market, early to adoption. So there's certainly a lot more speed to it. And certainly the private property nature aspects is very interesting as well. Now, of course, it also has its own set of kind of technical things that they have to overcome, since it doesn't have clear demarcation, lanes, and things that typically the computer vision, lidars, and cameras and other things will look for. Is it looking for contextual understanding? So in the case of, let's say, for example, Australian mining, private roads for the most part, or deserts for the most part, lot of room for, you can afford to have variance without, because there's really no people there, for instance. But what are the nuanced things that they have to be considering?
Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Damian Vaughn, former NFL player, Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
Yeah, dust, dirt, right? So sensors, especially cameras, maybe not radar as much. Radar isn't bothered so much by occlusion, dust and dirt and moisture in the air. However, LiDAR sensors and cameras are. And so if you're relying on LiDAR and cameras, you need to have better solutions for ensuring their field of view is not occluded, right? So that it has to be clean, right? That can also suggest that geolocation and other, let's call it high precision GPS and GNSS solutions can become more important because, again, those are that's a form of a sensor that is not troubled by particles in the air, whether it be dirt or whether it be moisture. Traction is also another factor at play. If you're running on slippery surfaces and very bumpy surfaces, that can have, that can cause your sensors to jostle about. It can also impact your overall vehicle dynamics if you're on a kind of a low coefficient of friction surface. Most of the time, when we're driving on a public road, we're not slipping unless you're a drifter. So most of the time, we're actually not slipping too much. But if we're driving in the mud at a farm or at a construction site or at a mine, that's another factor at play. But there's a variety of other factors as well. That's just kind of one example that comes to mind.
Yeah, makes sense. On the agriculture front, it's interesting because I think what we hear is the labor shortage. So therefore, at least it's portrayed that there's a higher demand, higher need for automation, in particularly autonomous vehicles and so forth, tractors, things that's actually working on larger farms. But I wonder at the ground level, the farmers, the cooperatives, maybe to some extent the corporations as well, is there really demand for these types of new forms of automation? And what is the kind of adoption that's really happening in terms of, again, the reality versus what's portrayed?
Right. Even before COVID, there were substantial farm labor shortages here in the US. Also with, for example, Brexit in the UK. So there's other nations around the world aside from America that do have farm labor shortages. South America, for example, as well. Chile is a place where we've actually found is a pretty attractive place for verdant robotics to operate. So challenge that exists around the world, perhaps exacerbated further by some of the political climate and the COVID climate that's out there right now.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Now, coming back to the automotive side, some of the things that we've seen is as much as there's a lot of hype around autonomous vehicle, electrification of vehicles and so forth, when it comes to the auto manufacturers and certainly the OEMs, their willingness to adopt new components, new technology is still relatively slow. Is that true, or it really depends on what kind of component we're talking about?
I think the willingness of an automaker to adopt a new technology or component that goes into their vehicle, or a new method of conducting their business. For example, instead of selling a car, perhaps providing a mobility service. GM had their Maven operation for a time there, and a lot of the automakers have had various mobility services efforts. So it really depends on who the automaker is. Some automakers are laggards in some technology domains, and some are leaders in other technology domains. So it depends on the automaker. It also depends on the technology. If you look across most of the major incumbent automakers, there's varying degrees of technological advancement. I would say if you look across CAST, our five main buckets, most of them embracing telematics these days, most embracing into varying degrees autonomy, most embracing shared mobility, and now electrification as well. When you think about digitization, well, that includes Industry 4.0, which is basically using IT inside in the internal operations of a corporation. A lot of automakers are using, for example, in our portfolio, Cogniac, which automates visual inspection of vehicles and auto parts on the assembly line for quality assurance purposes. There's a lot of automakers that are using not just Cogniac, but other Industry 4.0 solutions for their internal operations. And then now, especially accelerated by COVID, a lot of the auto industry is thinking more digitally in terms of the way it distributes and services vehicles. So there's they call this digital retailing, right? So basically selling cars and other vehicles online instead of requiring the traditional visit to the dealer. And so we've invested into some companies in that space as well, like Digital Motors. So really depends on company to company and geography to geography. I would say that all the upstart automakers, whether it be Rivian, or I don't know if you can call Tesla an upstart anymore, but those kind of let's say new entrant EV OEMs, those folks are really kind of pushing the envelope to differentiate by way of the tech that goes in the vehicles and the way they distribute those vehicles. In some cases, circumventing the franchise dealer network that the incumbent automakers are wedded to, at least here in the U.S.
Yeah. Let's see. We only have just a few seconds left. Actually, early on, you shared a little bit of insights in terms of lessons learned. But I wonder if there is any one poignant advice that you would give to startups that are in this particular sector.
One. If I had to just pick one, think carefully about product line extension and geographic expansion in the context of access to capital, meaning the more access to capital you have, the more tempted you will be to expand your product lines and to expand the geographies that you serve. And sometimes that can work masterfully, and you can go and kind of dominate the planet in multiple technology segments at once. But sometimes it can also bite you, as I experienced with Better Place.
Amazing. So with that, I have been joined by Quin Garcia, who is a managing director at Autotech Ventures. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Scott.
All right.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.